I've been living in Vietnam for the past 6 years. For the last 3.5 I've been researching Vietnamese art history. People often look at Vietnam through the lens of war, they look at it through political and social lens, and I've tried to look at it through the art, to look at the stories of these individuals who've experienced this history, and also through their art I've tried to communicate it back out. Tati went to this French fine art school. He then joined Ho Chi Minh's resistance zone. So using all the skills that the French had taught him, he made anti-French art. But during the time that he was there, the Chinese under Mao Zedong were supporting them, and there was a huge program taking place with Mao's communists, which was really a kind of class war. And they took these young French-educated bourgeois artists and they tried to kind of turn them into good revolutionary artists by using a method of education called criticism and self-criticism. And Tati, like many of the other artists, as you can probably imagine, it wasn't their favorite pastime. And he decided to leave, and he wasn't the only one, because up in that resistance zone were poets and writers and artists. And he left, he went back to Hanoi for a while, and then he decided to come down to the south. So he essentially switched sides during the war. So he's one of these fascinating threads of history in one person's life that can bring all of the other parts of Vietnamese history into focus, because you see them move from areas. So then he was down here during the 1960s and 70s and thrived, and ended up being this incredibly pioneering abstract painter. So he was also working for the South Vietnamese government, which meant that in 1975 and 76, when Trung Trinh, Ho Chi Minh's right-hand man, was rethinking culture and rethinking how it was going to happen in the South, he had a large artist education program, but because Tati had worked for the South Vietnamese government, he was put into a re-education camp, and actually was there in one for 8 years. Was released, made several attempts to leave by boat, and the final time he made it was in a refugee camp for 2 years, and then was actually sponsored by a church in Orange County. So he lived there till 2005. And he actually came back in the mid-90s and had exhibitions in Hanoi as well, which is extraordinary. Here we are in one of the tributaries of the Mekong Delta. And for centuries this has been a place, a hideout for rebels and revolutionaries. And particularly during the Vietnam War, this was a place where a lot of rebels were hiding out in order to be closer to Saigon. Now, as you can probably imagine, materials were scarce at that point, so they made a lot of materials themselves. They learned about the trees that they could use. They could get pigments from certain fruits, and they made these into paints. And when things got really tough, they would take cooking pots, which had been blackened by open fires, and they'd scrape off the bottom of them into a black powder, and then they would mix it with gun oil, and this would give them an oily black paint.